The smoke is still rising from Kharg Island, somewhere in the Persian Gulf, a narrow, contested strip of water that carries roughly 20% of the world's traded oil through a choke point barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest. The calculations being made right now in Washington, Tehran, Riyadh, and London will determine whether the next few weeks produce a negotiated pause or something that no one in those capitals has yet fully prepared their publics for. Donald Trump has announced that military targets on Kharg Island, Iran's single most important petroleum export terminal, the facility through which roughly 90% of Iran's oil revenue flows, have been, in his words, totally obliterated. He has called on the United Kingdom and other allied nations to commit naval forces to help secure the Strait of Hormuz. Air raid sirens have sounded in Jerusalem, and Tehran, which has spent decades calculating how to threaten the global energy system without actually triggering the full force of a superpower response, has now stated explicitly that oil and energy infrastructure connected to American interests could be, in their words, turned into a pile of ashes. Most coverage of this moment will give you the headlines, the explosions, the statements, the market reactions. What this channel exists to provide is something different. The analytical tradition represented by Ray McGovern, 27 years at the CIA, including service as a daily intelligence briefer to senior White House officials, is not a tradition of headlines. It is a tradition of pattern recognition, of asking before the dust has settled and before the narrative has hardened, what does the documented record actually show? What do professional intelligence assessments, the ones written before the political pressure arrives, actually say? And most critically, who benefits from the story being told the way it is currently being told? Because here is the question that the mainstream coverage is not yet asking with the rigor it deserves. Is the targeting of Kharg Island a decisive military victory that changes Iran's strategic calculus, or is it a dramatic escalation that has simultaneously destroyed one of the primary economic levers that a negotiated off-ramp would have required? That is not a rhetorical question. It is an analytical one. And the answer, drawn from the documented intelligence record, from the history of coercive economic warfare, and from the framework McGovern's work has consistently applied to exactly these kinds of moments, is not the answer that either the triumphalist or the catastrophist framing in current media coverage suggests. By the end of this analysis, you will understand three things that the current coverage is not providing: what the documented intelligence record actually tells us about Iran's decision-making framework at moments of maximum economic pressure, what historical precedent says about the strategic consequences of destroying an adversary's primary revenue source before any negotiated framework is in place, and why the call to bring allied naval forces into the Strait of Hormuz is not simply a security measure. It is a commitment architecture with consequences that extend far beyond this week. Let's build the picture properly. Begin with what the documented record actually says. The U.S. intelligence community's publicly available annual threat assessments, the unclassified versions of the comprehensive threat picture that the Director of National Intelligence presents to Congress each year, have been remarkably consistent on the subject of Iran's nuclear and military intentions. Not hawkish, not dovish. Consistent. The 2023 assessment stated clearly the mass murder, that Iran was not at that time conducting activities necessary to produce a nuclear device. The 2024 assessment maintain substantially the same framing. These are not positions derived from soft analysis or diplomatic accommodation. They are the product of the professional intelligence community's best technical and human collection. This matters enormously to the current moment because there is a documented pattern, one that McGovern has spent the better part of 2 decades publicly documenting and analyzing between what the professional intelligence community assesses and what the political leadership of the moment chooses to communicate to the public. McGovern's most prominent contribution to public understanding of this pattern came in the context of Iraq as a co-founder of Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, VIPS. He was part of a group of senior intelligence officers who, in real time, challenged the politicization of intelligence products in the lead up to the 2003 invasion. The core argument was not ideological, it was methodological. When the conclusion is fixed in advance and the intelligence is worked backward to support that conclusion, the analysis is no longer intelligence. It is advocacy, and advocacy dressed as intelligence is uniquely dangerous because it carries the institutional authority of the intelligence community without the intellectual honesty that makes that authority legitimate. The Senate Intelligence Committee's 2004 investigation, the subsequent Rob Silverman Commission, and the declassified records that have accumulated since all document in the publicly available record exactly the kind of gap between raw assessment and political presentation that McGovern and VIPS identified in real time. Question this analytical framework demands we ask about the current Iran situation is precise. What does the prof? A national intelligence community's documented assessment of Iran's actual decision-making calculus suggests about the likely effect of destroying Kharg Island's infrastructure, not the political talking points. The professional assessment, the answer drawn from decades of documented analysis of Iranian strategic behavior is this: Iranian's leadership confronted with what it assesses as an existential economic attack does not historically respond by capitulating. It responds by expanding its options, it signals to regional partners, it activates proxy networks, it raises the cost of the confrontation for the party it calculates is more risk averse about a prolonged engagement. Congressional Research Service analyses, which are part of the publicly documented analytical record, have consistently noted Iran's doctrine of escalation management, the deliberate use of calibrated responses designed to raise costs without triggering the full threshold of a superpower military response. Destroying Kharg Island is not a surgical pressure point. It is, by documented historical and strategic logic, the removal of a pressure point that a future negotiating framework would have needed intact. The gap between that analytical reality and the triumphalist framing currently dominating the public discourse. That gap is exactly what this channel exists to make visible. McGovern's publicly documented methodology, refined over 27 years of professional intelligence work and 2 decades of public analysis, rests on the specific discipline of pattern recognition, not pattern assumption, pattern recognition, the careful comparison of present circumstances against the documented record of how similar configurations of incentives, pressures, and institutional dynamics have resolved in the past. Apply that discipline to the current moment. The pattern that those familiar with H. McGovern's work would immediately identify in the current situation is this: a military action of high symbolic and economic impact announced with maximum rhetorical force in the absence of a parallel diplomatic architecture capable of absorbing the response it will generate. This is not a new pattern. It is among the most consistently documented failure modes in the history of coercive military strategy. Coercion theory, the body of strategic analysis developed from Schelling through the post-Cold War literature, makes a specific documented distinction between compellence and deterrence. Deterrence prevents an adversary from taking an action they haven't yet taken. Compellence attempts to force an adversary to change a course of action already in progress. The documented record of compellence operations from the bombing of North Vietnam through the sanctions regimes of the 1990s and 2000s shows consistently that compellence without a visible off-ramp produces not capitulation, but entrenchment. McGovern's analytical framework, built on his documented critique of intelligence politicization, adds a second layer to this, the institutional pressure to describe a compellence operation as more successful than the underlying evidence supports creates a second order problem. The gap between the claimed success and the actual strategic situation widens. Decision makers operating on the inflated assessment rather than the professional one make subsequent decisions based on a picture that doesn't match reality. The compellence campaign escalates not because the evidence demands it, but because the narrative has committed the institution to a trajectory that the facts are no longer supporting. The most analytically precise parallel in the documented record is not Iraq, though that parallel is relevant. It is the documented history of the air campaign against North Vietnamese infrastructure in the mid-1960s, the Gulf of Tonkin episode, which McGovern has addressed directly in his public writings and recorded appearances, is the canonical case in American intelligence history of the gap between what the professional record showed and what political leadership chose to present. The attack that triggered the resolution authorizing expanded military force in Vietnam was, in the documented professional intelligence record, far more ambiguous than it was presented to Congress and the public. The consequences of that gap between professional assessment and political presentation are in the historical record for any serious analyst to examine. The relevant parallel to the current moment is not the initial incident, it is what happened after the commitment architecture was established. Once Allied naval forces are formally committed to securing the Strait of Hormuz, the political and institutional cost of not following through on that commitment rises dramatically. The commitment becomes self-reinforcing. The escalation ladder becomes harder to step back from at each successive rung. Who benefits from the current dominant framing, the framing of Kharg Island destruction as a decisive strategic victory? This is not a rhetorical question. It has documented answers. The current framing benefits those who have an interest in maintaining the escalatory trajectory rather than creating conditions for a negotiated pause. It benefits actors in the regional architecture whose strategic interests are served by sustained US-Iran confrontation rather than accommodation. And it benefits within the domestic political economy of the United States those institutional and commercial interests that have consistently opposed the kind of diplomatic engagement with Iran that the 2015 JCPOA represented. None of this requires conspiracy. It requires only the application of the basic analytical question that McGovern's framework consistently returns to: who bono, who benefits, follow the incentives. then compare them against the documented strategic record. The answer that emerges from that analysis is not comfortable. It is simply what the evidence shows. It is important to be precise here. This is not an argument that mainstream media organizations are engaged in deliberate deception. That framing, however satisfying it may feel, is both analytically imprecise and strategically unhelpful. The structural reality is more specific and more consequential. Access journalism, the form of journalism that depends on proximity to official sources for its basic raw material, creates documented structural incentives towards certain kinds of omissions, not lying. Omission, the story that fits the official framing, gets confirmed by officials who have an interest in that framing. The question that would destabilize the official framing tends not to be asked, not because the journalist is corrupt, but because asking it risks the access that makes the journalism possible. McGovern has addressed this dynamic directly and repeatedly in his public writings and appearances. His documented critique is not of individual journalists, but of the institutional structure of official source dependency in national security journalism. The pattern is consistent. At moments of high stakes escalation, the gap between what the professional intelligence assessment shows and what the official public narrative claims tends to be at its widest, and the mainstream coverage tends to be at its least equipped to make that gap visible. What is that gap in the current coverage? First, the strategic significance of destroying Kharg Island rather than threatening it is receiving almost no analytical attention in any serious coercive strategy analysis. The distinction matters enormously. A threatened asset gives the adversary an incentive to negotiate. A destroyed asset removes that incentive and simultaneously creates a domestic political imperative inside Iran to demonstrate that the loss was not simply absorbed. Second, the call for allied naval forces in the Strait of Hormuz is being covered primarily as a logistics and security question when it is actually in the analytical language of commitment theory and entrapment risk. When multiple allied nations have committed naval assets to a defined mission, the decision-making calculus of any one of them regarding escalation or de-escalation changes fundamentally. The UK does not make its Strait of Hormuz decisions independently once it has assets committed alongside US forces. This is not a criticism. It is an analytical observation about how multilateral commitment architectures affect individual state decision making. The documented historical record on this is extensive. The current coverage is treating it as a detail. Third, the Iranian threat to target oil and energy infrastructure connected to US-linked firms is being reported as rhetoric. Analysts familiar with Iranian strategic communication and McGovern's framework specifically attends to the gap between how adversaries communicate and how those communications are filtered through political processing before reaching public discourse. Would note that Iranian strategic communication at moments of maximum pressure tends to announce in advance actions it intends to take. This is not posturing for domestic consumption. It is doctrine. These are not fringe observations. They are the kinds of questions that any trained intelligence analyst applying a professional framework to the publicly available record would be asking right now. The fact that they are largely absent from mainstream coverage is itself a data point about the structural limits of access journalism at moments of high stakes official narrative investment. To understand where the current moment fits in the longer arc, it is necessary to hold several decades of documented history in view simultaneously. The US Iran confrontation is not a product of the current administration, the previous one, or the one before that. It is the accumulated product of a specific traceable sequence of decisions made by specific people in specific institutions that foreclosed certain options and created the conditions for the current crisis. The 1953 CIA assisted removal of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, the documented in the CIA's own declassified records released in 2013, is not ancient history in the Iranian political memory. It is constitutive history, the institutional memory of how external powers have engaged with Iranian sovereignty and Iranian natural resources. Is not a rhetorical talking point in Tehran. It is the foundational frame through which Iranian decision makers interpret every subsequent engagement. McGovern's analytical framework, grounded in his documented understanding of how institutional memory shapes intelligence assessments and strategic decisions, would insist on the analytical relevance of this history, not as a justification for Iranian actions, but as the necessary context without which predictions about Iranian behavior are systematically unreliable. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, represented a documented moment where an alternative trajectory was briefly established. The U.S. intelligence community's own assessments in the period following the agreement's implementation documented Iranian compliance with its terms. The 2018 U.S. withdrawal from the agreement, a unilateral decision taken against the explicit advice of U.S. allies and in the documented record against the publicly stated analysis of senior intelligence officials, set in motion the sequence of events that has led through a traceable chain of decisions to the current moment. This is not partisan analysis. It is the documented historical record. McGovern's publicly stated position, consistent across his writings and recorded appearances, has been that geopolitical catastrophes of this kind are not inevitable. They are the accumulated result of choices made by specific people at specific decision points. The choices made in 2018 and 2020 and at multiple subsequent junctures were made in the presence of professional intelligence assessments that documented the likely consequences of those choices. Whether those assessments were presented accurately to decision makers and whether those decision makers gave them appropriate weight are questions that the documented record has not yet fully answered and may not for years. What the documented record does show consistently across the history McGovern and his BIPS colleagues have analyzed is that when warning intelligence is available, is professionally produced, and is systematically not acted upon, the consequences of that gap tend to arrive with a force proportional to how long the gap was maintained. The smoke from Kharg Island is in that analytical framing, not a beginning. It is a consequence. The question is whether the institutions now making decisions about what comes next have access to the professional intelligence picture and whether they are choosing to act on it based on the documented analytical record, not on speculation, not on optimism, not on the political preferences of any particular faction. There are several plausible trajectories emerging from the current configuration of pressures, commitments, and incentives. The first trajectory, CTR, is continued escalation without a negotiated architecture. This is the path of least institutional resistance given the current commitment structure. Allied naval forces are being deployed. The destruction of Kharg Island has created domestic political imperatives inside Iran that its leadership cannot simply absorb without visible response. The documented pattern of Iranian strategic behavior at comparable moments suggests that response will be calibrated, costly enough to demonstrate that the attack was not cost-free, controlled enough to avoid triggering the full threshold of a superpower response. The risk in this trajectory is what the strategic literature calls inadvertent escalation, not a deliberate decision to go to war, but a sequence of calibrated responses that through miscalculation, friction, or domestic political pressure on one or more sides, crosses a threshold that was not intended to be crossed. The second trajectory is a negotiated pause, not a resolution, but a pause, brokered through back channel architecture involving intermediary states. The documented history of US-Iran confrontation includes several such pauses. The 1981 Algiers Accords that ended the hostage crisis, the back channel communications that preceded various tactical de-escalations. The analytical question is whether the current institutional and political environment in Washington, in Tehran, and among the allied and regional actors with stakes in the outcome as the architecture to support such a pause before the escalation ladder rises to a rung where the commitment costs of stepping back exceed the perceived costs of continuing upward. The third trajectory, the one that McGovern's documented analytical framework would identify as historically grounded but institutionally most demanding, is a genuine diplomatic framework built on the documented record of what made the JCPOA viable before its collapse, adjusted for the current strategic reality, and supported by a professional intelligence assessment that is presented honestly to decision makers rather than filtered through the political incentives of the moment. The documented record shows that this kind of outcome has been achieved before in precisely the kind of environment that conventional wisdom describes as too hostile for negotiation. The documented history of back-channel diplomacy at moments of peak public confrontation. Nixon China, the back-channel communications that preceded the end of the Cold War, shows consistently that the public posture and the private decision-making architecture can, when the institutional will exists, diverge enough to create the conditions for outcomes that the public posture makes appear impossible. McGovern's documented belief, stated in his writings and public appearances, is that an informed citizenry is itself a strategic factor. That public awareness of the real analytical picture, as opposed to the official narrative version, creates pressure on institutions that is itself part of the decision-making environment. This analysis is not offered as a passive briefing. It is offered as a contribution to that informed citizenry. The leverage points exist. The documented historical record shows they have been used before. Whether they will be used now depends on choices being made in rooms that most people never see. The purpose of this analysis is to make those rooms a little less invisible. We began this analysis with smoke rising from Kharg Island and a question that the mainstream coverage has not yet asked with sufficient rigor: is the destruction of Iran's primary oil export facility strategic victory, or the removal of a leverage point that the negotiated off-ramp would have required? The answer, drawn from the documented record of coercive strategy from the professional intelligence assessment of Iranian decision-making, And from the historical framework, McGovern's work has consistently applied to exactly these moments. Is this military force applied without a parallel diplomatic architecture does not compel adversaries with deep institutional memories of external coercion. It entrenches them, and it does so at precisely the moment when the commitment architecture allied naval forces, public rhetoric, political investment makes stepping back most costly. By this channel has built toward across this analysis is a single analytical insight worth holding. The gap between what the professional intelligence record shows and what the dominant public narrative claims is not an accident. It is at key historical moments a choice with documented consequences, a choice that the document. Ed record shows ordinary citizens equipped with the real analytical picture have at moments helped to alter what Ray McGovern's documented life and work consistently returns to is this: the truth, even when inconvenient, even when it contradicts the official framing, even when the institutions that should be presenting it are choosing not to. The truth is the only foundation on which sound decisions can be made. Everything built on a false picture eventually collides with reality. The question is only how much it costs before that collision arrives. The question this analysis leaves you with is not comfortable. It is if the professional intelligence community's actual assessment of the strategic consequences of the current trajectories is different from the official public narrative as the documented historical pattern suggests. The mass murder right now is making sure that assessment reaches the people who need to act on it. Subscribe. Share this with someone who is trying to make sense of what's happening and isn't finding the analytical depth they need. The mission of the McGovern lens is to bring the standards of honest intelligence work to an audience that deserves better than what the dominant framing is providing. Strategy without honest intelligence is not strategy, it is improvisation with consequences.